Welcome to the Covered Bridges in New Hampshire podcast, where we discuss all things related to covered bridges in the Granite State. Here's your host, Kim Chandler.
Hello, Covered Bridge people, and welcome to the podcast. Today we're speaking with Dave Anderson, Senior Director of Education for the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests. Dave discusses the history and setting of the Sentinel Pine Bridge in Flume Gorge and how it fits within the broader stewardship of Franconia Notch State Park. Here we go. In this episode, we'll learn about the Sentinel Pine Bridge. The bridge is located within the confines of the Flume Gorge in Franconia Notch State Park, a 6,692-acre park established in 1928. The Sentinel Pine Bridge is one of two covered bridges within the Flume that have a state number and was constructed in 1939 by the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests. Today we're speaking with Dave Anderson, Senior Director of Education for the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests. Dave joined the Forest Society in 1990 and is responsible for the design, development, and delivery of conservation education programs, including field trips, workshops, and presentations for Forest Society members, conservation partners, schools, and the general public. Dave is well known as a naturalist, guiding field trip tours on the Society's forest reservations statewide while teaching about forest ecology, wildlife habitats, stewardship of forest resources, and land conservation to introduce lifelong residents and visitors alike to the protection and wise use of New Hampshire's forests, conservation land, and open space. Dave is a co-author of the Forest Journal column in the statewide New Hampshire Sunday News. His quarterly Nature's View columns are a longtime regular feature in the Forest Society's quarterly Forest Notes magazine. Dave is a writer and co-host of Something Wild, the natural history and forest-related Friday radio feature and podcast on New Hampshire Public Radio. Dave received the prestigious 2014 Fred E. Bean Award for effective, fair, and balanced statewide communications on issues affecting agriculture and forestry in New Hampshire. He is the 2022 recipient of the New Hampshire Timberland Owners Annual President's Award for forest-related communication and public relations. He lives on a 48-acre certified New Hampshire tree farm in South Sutton. Welcome to the podcast, Dave.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here today. I want to talk to you about the Sentinel Pine Covered Bridge that is located in the Flume Gorge. But first, I think it's important that maybe we start by talking about Franconia Notch State Park.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. And, the bridge for me was a bridge into a bunch of stories and history that sort of overlap over different eras in Franconia Notch. And the one that I know best is the Forest Society's work in 1927 and 28 to actually purchase Franconia Notch. But let me back up and mention that in Franconia Notch, for 70 years, there was this incredible grand hotel called the Profile House, which was located approximately where the parking lot is for the Cannon Mountain aerial tramway. And that first opened in 1853. So this is a pre-Civil War grand hotel. And then it burned in 1923. But I'll get to that. It was a huge, luxurious hotel. It was run by a company that owned all of Franconia Notch, including the Old Man of the Mountain and the Flume and the Basin and the Boise Rock. All the sort of roadside things we think of along what was then the Daniel Webster Highway, the old Route 3 prior to the construction of I-93. There were travel guides I'm reading from the Upper Pemigewasset Historical Society newsletter, and it talks about the fact that in 1872, they built this narrow gauge railroad from Bethlehem to eliminate the stagecoach ride. And they had a 9.5-mile railroad that led up into Franconia Notch and all kinds of amenities up there for a self-sufficient community. They had a farm and a dairy herd and a greenhouse, a power plant, a boathouse, a steam launch on Echo Lake. In other words, a boat on Echo Lake, which is now a state beach. They had dormitories for the help, a bowling alley, a post office, a telegraph office, a barber shop, a billiard hall, a music room, souvenir shops, a golf course, and more. There was a fish hatchery for raising trout to restock a trout pool for the guests at the hotel. And that's still visible on the east side of I-93 as you're going through the notch right opposite the ski trails at Cannon Mountain. And that little pool is actually the very headwaters of the Merrimack River. It's the beginning of the north branch of the Pemigewasset River, which eventually joins with the east branch in Lincoln, and then the Winnipesaukee River to become the Merrimack River. So
Merrimack, yeah.
if you go from the ocean to the source, you would find yourself in Franconia Notch. And they own thousands of acres, 11,000 acres in Franconia Notch, as I said, including the Old Man of the Mountain, the basin, the pool, the flume. And there was a mineral spring that provided water for their guests. The hotel was a huge local employer, and there were all kinds of jobs from farmers to baggage men and engineers and brakemen and a fireman for the railroad. They had a completely self-sufficient resort community, and people would spend the entire summer. And it was owned by a gentleman named Colonel Greeley, and I know that he's the namesake of the Greeley Ponds. um, I'm sorry, this is wrong. So his name is Colonel Greenleaf,
Okay.
and there's the Greenleaf Hut
The hut, right.
on the side of Mount Lafayette. So they actually ended up rebuilding that hotel, that profile house. After they built the Mount Washington Hotel, they felt like they needed to upgrade, so they built the new profile house in 1906, and then, um, they operated that until about 1921, and then they sold it. So the first profile house complex, uh, I'm sorry, 1921 was sold by Colonel Greenleaf, who owned the
Mm.
hotel, and he retired, and he sold that hotel and 11,000 acres, to Carl Abbott, who was a 32-year-old entrepreneur, and he and his father owned hotels in Bethlehem, including the Uplands Hotel and the Forest Hills Hotel. And then, this is amazing, on August 2nd, 1923, at the height of the summer season, there was a catastrophic fire that broke out and destroyed the entire
Mhm.
hotel complex, including 26 other buildings, and all of it burned to the ground in 4 hours. I
Oh
mean,
my.
completely razed. It was this windy, hot summer day.
Ugh.
All of the guests were there, and the whole thing went up in flames, including many private homes that were built on the campus of the profile house. And
Ugh.
they weren't sure exactly what they were gonna do. They considered rebuilding, but they decided to sell. And that included 11,000 acres and the Old Man of the Mountain and the Flume and what is now Cannon Mountain and the aerial tramway, that whole area. And there's some amazing old growth up in there that have been never been cut that's still there today, that was owned by the owners of the profile house. And in 1926, there were some speculators who wanted to buy it as a timber investment and clear cut the notch.
Mm.
And that's when the Forest Society's first employee, who was a forester named Philip Ayres, who was the savior of Mount Monadnock and Mount Sunapee and Lost River, and had been campaigning for the establishment of the White Mountain National Forest from the Forest Society's inception in 1901, till 1911, when the federal legislation was passed to create the White Mountain National Forest and several other eastern national forests. Ayers got involved because he wanted to prevent the logging and save the scenic attributes, and they persuaded Governor Winant and the legislature in New Hampshire to appropriate half of the money that it was going to take to buy all of that property, the site of the former profile house. The total price for 5,000 acres was $400,000. So Governor Winant and the New Hampshire legislature said, "We'll give you half. Here's 200,000, but you've got to raise the rest." And the deadline was June of 1928, the following year. So by fall of 1927, they had a commitment. And then the Forest Society launched this campaign that went international. And in our time, we would say it went viral. And they sold trees for $1 each by subscription. So you could buy a tree, and the headline in the Manchester Union, uh, newspaper said, "Send in your dollars, buy as many trees as your patriotism allows." Many colleges and universities designated, the white birch trees as sort of memorial to fallen soldiers in World War I, and they
Uh,
had alumni who had served overseas, and died, and so alumni associations contributed dollars in memory of specific, uh, servicemen who were alumni. The New Hampshire Women's Club, of real force of economic, do-goodery in New Hampshire, and it's always been a solid partner for conservation interests in terms of scenery. They actually set quotas for their various chapters, and they raised $65,000.
Wow.
And then with contributions as small as a nickel, school children alone raised $1,000 in nickels and dimes. But thousands of people donated from across the nation and the world, and they raised that full sum of the additional 200,000 in 6 months before the June 1928 deadline to purchase that land, and then in the fall, September of 1928, that Franconia Notch State Park was designated, by the state of New Hampshire and dedicated. They had a dedication ceremony.
Wow.
So, yeah, it was quite a story that, for 400,000, that land was purchased to become a state park. However, in the annals of the Forest Society history, it said that's when the trustees of the Forest Society got the shock of their lives when the legislature said, "Well, you wanted this thing done, you gotta run it." And
Yeah, you should
so the
always be careful what you wish for, right?
Right. So there wasn't at that time a New Hampshire State Parks Department. And this is a really, like, little known part of New Hampshire history. There was a division of forestry that existed, and it wasn't really until after World War II, 1948, 20 years after the 1928 purchase, that, there was a state park, the state park division, which was a division of the Department of Forestry. So a number of places that the Forest Society had, which later became state parks, including land on Mount Sunapee, was transferred in March of 1948, land on Mount Kearsarge in the early 1950s. And that's when 1948 is when the state of New Hampshire took over, actually operating attractions like the Flume and the beach at Echo Lake. But for the first 20 years, from 1928 to 1948, the Forest Society operated the Flume and hired summer crews of college students as guides to take people through the Flume. It was very much like Lost River, which the Forest Society still owns to this day,
Mhm.
where we had summer college students serving as, like, interpretive guides in the gorge, helping people over rough terrain and ladders and stairs and boardwalks, getting them to attractions like Lost River and the Flume.
Mhm. I went to Lost River 2 summers ago, I think,
Mhm.
and I did not go into some of the little crevices and things that you could, have a
The
panic
caves.
attack in. I left those for the young people. But there is a nice covered bridge there. Not to
Yes.
not to go off topic, but there is a nice covered bridge at Lost River.
Yeah, I don't know if that's chronicled. I don't know if that's one of the New Hampshire covered bridges.
It is not.
Hmm,
It is not.
I never thought of that, Kim. It's
Mhm.
true.
Mhm.
And I can't remember the name of that covered bridge, but it was built by the crew there one summer,
It's the
just like the
Allen Hollis covered bridge.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Yes. So, I'm not sure who Alan Hollis was. I think he was one of the superintendents of
I think he was.
Lost River Reservation
Yeah.
working for the Forest Society.
Mhm.
But that
Yeah.
parallels that's just another parallel to the Flume because 10 years into the 20-year tenure that the Forest Society had of managing the Flume within this newly established Franconia Notch State Park, a cataclysm happened,
Mm.
and probably the most, signature forest disturbance of the last century. And what is that?
I'm gonna guess it was the hurricane of 1938.
Perfect. You get A. You are right on. So, in September, I think it was September 21, right around the autumnal equinox, the hurricane of '38 came through New Hampshire and blew down 5 billion board feet of trees in New
Mm.
Hampshire alone, of which they salvaged 400 million board feet, and some of that lumber that was sawed up in sawmills, including one in Concord at Turkey Pond that was operated by an all-women sawmill crew because the men were overseas in 1942. when they were salvaging the remains of that 30 hurricane blowdown. Some of that wood went into something called the Wartime Timber Salvage Program and ended up building barracks for U.S. troops or for prisoner of war camps in places like Stark. But
Mm,
some of it was shipped to Europe. So the trees that were blown down in New Hampshire, the white pines that were milled into boards, some of them ended up going into U.S. bases in Europe
that's
for the
awesome.
European front. And it's an obscure thing, the Wartime Timber Salvage Program. Also, in the 1930s, prior to the hurricane, those were the that was the Great Depression era. So there were federal civilian conservation corps crews working throughout the White Mountains and building camps and doing infrastructure improvements and campgrounds throughout the young, growing White Mountain National Forest. So there was these federal armies. There was the CCC,
Hmm.
and then there was an army of people left behind on the home front during the early part of World War II, sawing up the timber salvage of that 1938 hurricane. And among all the trees that fell down was one particularly tall white pine, very far north for white pine, which really its natural range is mostly south of the White Mountains. And that was the Sentinel Pine at Franconia Notch in the Flume, overlooking a feature that's called the Pool. And that tree, after it was blown down, 60 feet of the trunk were used as a central stringer to build a covered bridge to close a gap in the gorge below the gorge which basically the uppermost section of the Pemigewasset River, the North Branch, at the southern end of the notch. That tree was hoisted using block and tackle and teams of horses 100 feet up above the river onto the ledges overlooking the pool. And there was the central stringer for a footbridge, which is the Sentinel Pine Covered Bridge, which is bridge number 38, right?
Mm-hmm. It sure is. And
So
and
go
it,
ahead.
yeah, can you talk about what the pool is and like what the flume look like?
Right. So this had been a tourist attraction long before even, the profile house was built at the northern end of the notch. And the pool is a pool in the Pemigewasset River. And then there's a brook that comes down through the Flume and it has its confluence there. And the Flume is a steep gorge with walls that go up to 120 feet, covered with moss. And there's a boardwalk that leads people through the Flume. And there's a trail from where the visitor center is today up to the Flume. And then it loops around and comes down to where the pool was. But at one time, the most direct route was to hike up the riverbank to the pool, and there was an eccentric gentleman whose name was Dr. John Merrill, who was known as the philosopher of the pool. And this is some crazy stuff. Now we're back in the 1800s, and in 1853 to 1883, approximately for 30 years, this guy just set up shop and constructed um, a little boat, and people could get on board, and he would row them around the pool and he would preach from a little belief he had. He operated a boat, a ferry, and he was called the philosopher of the pool because he believed that the earth was hollow. So there was this gap in the loop for half a century after John Merrill died in the 1880s that was later filled by the Sentinel Pool. But this famous philosopher of the pool had a peculiar theory on the origin of the universe. And in 1853, he built a crude boat and put it in the pool, which then measured 40 feet deep and 150 feet in diameter. And as described in Eastman's White Mountain Guide from 1869, the philosopher was an old enthusiast who appeared to live in a boat of somewhat novel construction upon the waters of this retired pool and will, for a small gratuity, give anyone who desires it a ride in his ark-like dwelling, and will propound a theory of creation not found in standard authorities. He's also constructed a path from the pool to the flume, which much shortens the distance between the two places, but which is somewhat difficult, though not wholly impractical to the ladies. So again, it was about making things comfortable so that people from cities felt comfortable in the wilderness and they might meet this eccentric. And there are other eccentrics in the White Mountains. I mean, I don't even get me started on the Wolf Man at Clark's Trading
I
Post,
know,
but
right?
eh, there are so many children who, like, needed therapy after going to Clark's Trading Post because
I
of
I agree. I actually, we had a behind the scenes tour of
Mhm.
Clark's, of that bridge, and I got to stand next to him when the train came by, so I know the hiding spot and watched him come out. It was priceless to watch the
What
people's
a
faces
what a
on
gr
the train.
what a great job. How do you get that gig?
I don't
Oh,
know. Wouldn't that be
I'm gonna
great?
I'm gonna apply to be the Wolfman as a retirement gig someday.
Ah,
Just scaring people on a train, waving a gun around and driving like a jalopy. Anyway, so in that tradition of White Mountain eccentrics, Dr. Merrill, would row people across and then sell them a pamphlet. I don't know if he would not let them off the boat until they bought one of his pamphlets that said that the earth was hollow and that there were indeed like a parallel universe within inside the earth, and that there was also some other theory of creation that he propounded. But he died in the mid 1880s, so now we're 20 years beyond the Civil War, and we're into the Grand Hotel era. So he was probably also operating there in the early days of the Profile House. And the Profile House guests continued to go down to the Flume and visit the Flume, but there was basically one way in and one way out. They couldn't hike this loop that included the pool because there was no longer a ferry, but they could see the Sentinel Pine, which I'm told was somewhere between 125 and 150 feet tall, growing, overlooking the pool from the side of a gorge above it, where the upper headwaters of the Pemigewasset River fall 100 feet down to this 150-foot diameter pool,
hmm,
40 feet deep. So, and actually, I remember from Lucy Crawford's History of the White Mountains, published by the Appalachian Mountain Club, that it was a woman named Granny Witcher who discovered the flume and the pool while she was looking around for fishing holes.
mm,
So imagine Granny Witcher in the 1800s in the wilderness of the White Mountains, just looking for new places to catch brook trout, and finding these natural wonders. And these were not yet like on the national tourism map.
right. Well, and I think about how easy it is, for the most part, depending on traffic, for us to get up there
Mhm.
from southern parts and how challenging that must have been, particularly before that 9.5 mile railroad came in.
Sure.
The effort to get there
Right.
was awesome. I just,
The
so
the
yes, you would
stagecoach
spend the whole summer because probably
right,
by the time you got there, you needed it.
there were stagecoaches, there were horses and wagons moving freight in and out in terms of fresh produce, but that's why some of these hotels, these grand hotels, were really self-sufficient
Mhm.
summer communities, everything from the farm to the golf course to the trout fishing pool. And certainly Franconia Notch was, like Crawford Notch, considered an epicenter of White Mountain tourism, and they were clearly aware of competition between the grand hotels and the claims that they made for the most grandiose natural features. And it was getting play in the newspapers of the day, the Chicago Tribune, and in New York, Horace Greeley's newspaper. And he was the one who said, "Go west, young man." But these papers were promoting White Mountain things, attractions, Nathaniel Hawthorne's poem about, the Great Stone Face.
Right.
So New Hampshire was becoming a fabled location for this sublime and terrible scenery and wonderful legends of Crawford Notch and Franconia Notch and these places. So I'll take us back to 1928. The 5,000 acres was purchased for a new Franconia Notch State Park. And then 10 years later, the hurricane comes through, and virtually the entire national forest was closed in the summer of 1939 following the hurricane. And for several years, many places were closed to all hiking because the risk of fire was so high. And
Okay.
in fact, there were some terrible fires in that post-1938 hurricane era. The Great Marlow Stoddard Fire was in April of 1941. And then in October of 1947, there had been a summer drought, and that was the year that Maine was on fire. Bar Harbor burned to the ground. There was fire from, um, Fryeburg, Maine, all the way to Bar Harbor across Maine. Many towns in southern Maine were burned down or surrounded by flames.
Oh,
That
no.
was that was the year of the Great Sunapee Fire that burned 6 miles from Lake Solitude on Mount Sunapee Ridge all the way to within a mile of the Goshen Village. So the White Mountains were a tinderbox,
Wow.
for the years immediately following the hurricane, and they closed all of the attractions, and they closed the backcountry to any kind of hiking, because they were worried about, improper disposal
Mm.
of smoking materials. I mean, back then, if you went hiking, you brought cigarettes in a pipe. You know,
Sure.
I don't think many people have that in there. Now it's a vape, I guess.
Yeah, probably.
But, yeah, in that summer of 1939, the Forest Society had a crew, and they decided they were inspired by seeing this great sentinel pine laying in the pool to do something with it, and so they used block and tackle. They raised that trunk 4.5 feet in diameter, 100 feet up, and spanned the gorge above the pool and built a footbridge on it that became the Sentinel Pine Covered Bridge. And it's always been a footbridge. It hasn't been open to vehicle traffic. And so when I talked to Bill O'Connell, who had been at the information desk at the Flume, he said, "Well, it's also called the Romantic Bridge." And
Oh,
then
I've
I
never
said,
heard that.
well, it kind of made sense, right? Because if there's not cars coming by, people could sort of canoodle there on the bridge on there. I get bonus points like in Scrabble for using that word. And so it was this feature, and it's featured on postcards, of the time. And also, I think because it didn't carry vehicle traffic, it may not have been classified as a covered bridge. And I read someplace else it was referred to as a romantic shelter,
Mm,
meaning that it was rustic, and it was a shelter, but it wasn't truly a bridge carrying um, freight traffic or vehicle traffic. Although, according to Bill O'Connor, 200,000 people a year visit the Flume, and most of those pedestrians only cross that romantic bridge.
mm.
So you can imagine what happened over time when you've got an untreated pine log carrying a bridge across the gorge.
Yeah.
So, and this is now, let me see, 15 years essentially after the 1939, summer of 1939, when the bridge was built, the tree cracked and began to show signs of wear. And they brought in some cables and actually took a Model A Ford axle and drilled that into the rock and created a kind of a cable and turnbuckle system,
Ah,
just like they were installing up on the forehead of the old man of the mountain just north and the other end of Franconia Notch.
yeah.
And they tried to shore up, the Sentinel Pine central stringer. Um, and by the 1970s, the state was saying, we're gonna either have to close this bridge or do something. They actually moved steel I-beams there,
Mhm.
but they never had the funding to do the work that needed to be done, and those I-beams got diverted to some other project, so they were never installed. And in the 1980s, the state DOT bridge maintenance crew people got involved. A guy named Steve Canton,
Mhm.
who was DOT Bureau of Bridge Maintenance supervisor, and then a guy named Ken Olson, who had also worked for DOT for 32 years, and then he retired in 1990. But in 1983, he drew up a plan, and in the fall of 1983, October, they jacked up the Sentinel Pine footbridge, and they built a Bailey Bridge underneath it completely independently. And that Bailey Bridge was one of those World War II inventions, and you probably know more about this, that enabled them to span a river or a gorge without a lot of mechanical assistance.
Mhm.
They were using these in World War II to move troops and vehicles around, um, during the war. and they built that, beginning in October, and then they stopped when snowfall came in December, and they resumed in May of, 1984, and they built this thing 100 feet above the river and then lowered the old footbridge down onto it, and then they camouflaged it with wood, so you couldn't see any steel components of
Mhm.
the Bailey Bridge. They basically put a facade of wood over the whole thing, and beneath it is still suspended the decomposing trunk,
Yes, it is.
the the 1938 Hurricane Sentinel Pine,
Mhm.
and there still has some cables, and it still has some pieces of Model A axle drilled into the rock, but it no longer has any role in carrying the structural weight of the footbridge above it.
Right.
And at what Ken Olson said in looking back on this, because now it's 42 years ago that that work was done in 1984. I was actually a senior at Plymouth State University nearby, and this I was oblivious to this. We were climbing Cannon Cliff with our buddies in the summer. We weren't going into the flume because we considered it to be a tourist attraction, and maybe the worst thing you could call us when we were in college would be to call us a tourist. Yeah. We eschewed the charms of places like Polar Caves and
Uh,
and
uh.
Lost River and the
Yeah,
flume. But they did that work now 42 years ago and built this thing that they said was one of a kind, unique, and scary, 100 feet above the pool. And it is still there as one of New Hampshire's covered bridges, number 38,
yeah.
the
It's
romantic shelter.
you can, I don't know who may have done this, but you can kinda poke around underneath and still see the pine with its cables and its
I haven't
cracks.
That's cool. I need to see that before it tumbles into the river,
Yeah,
which
I don't
would
think
be
you're supposed to be crawling around under there, but somebody I think somebody may have done that, I'm not sure
so
who.
you're confessing this you may have known somebody who did that.
Yeah, I may have sent someone that I'm married to to do
Mhm.
that.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, well, I had to see it,
Well,
you know?
absolutely.
Yeah.
So
What
you have photos.
yeah, I actually I do. I have a photo. There's a photo in the book, so I guess I gave it away by publishing the photo.
Mhm.
What wh what do you think like, you think about this old pine, and you think about the history of timber and the whites and this sentinel pine still being there, not particularly of use necessarily, but what do you think that symbolizes or means to or should mean to visitors that go to the flume?
So there's so many layers of history, and it's interconnected with the history of the forest, which is basically the ecological history, and there's a really compelling connection between natural history and cultural history in New Hampshire, and I think above all else, people in New Hampshire are nostalgic. I think that maybe is a Yankee thing. I think about my my grandparents, and people, love to hear the repeating of the old stories and lore, and the idea of the hurricane, that was before my time. My mom was a little girl, she was born in 1933, so she was 5, and she talked about the New England hurricane. She was living down in outside of New Haven in Hamden, Connecticut, and I think about that. Wow, my mom was alive and remembers looking out the window when the hurricane of '38 was here. So there are these old timers who tell these stories, and sometimes they get written down, and it builds a really profound connection, to a really rich and almost ceremonious past in our state. And maybe sometimes as I now become an old timer myself, I worry about sort of the loss of those stories. So I always applaud regional and local historians who are doing oral history
Mhm,
and learning about these places, and it comes in layers. Like, I learned about the Forest Society's work to protect Franconia Notch, and then eventually learned about Dr. John Merrill, the philosopher of the pool, and then kinda delved a little bit into the flume and learned more about the Old Man of the Mountain, and of course, in our memory, just 2003, was it? The Old
mhm,
Man of the
yeah,
Mountain
it was.
retired?
Mhm,
And then I've also watched us lose people who were in their 80s and 90s who taught me things, and I look around and realize it's down to us.
mhm,
It's down to the present generation to be the keepers of the flame and try to remember these stories. And of course, we're also benefiting greatly from the internet because you can just type in the profile house or the fire of 1923 and get a tremendous amount of information that's in the Upper Pemigewasset Historical Society or
Hmm.
the Forest History Society. But I think the other thing to understand is that most people think the White Mountain National Forest always looked like it looks today.
Right.
And when we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Centennial of the Weeks Act, we went up on the Franconia Notch with a crew from WMUR from Chronicle, and a
Hmm.
really talented videographer, Cindy Jupp Jones, who unfortunately has passed away. And she was intrepid, and she would bring the broadcast camera and a tripod, and we went up and set up on the ridge, which is a 9-mile loop up, Lafayette, Lincoln, Little Haystack,
Hmm.
and we were filming looking out over the interior of the Pemigewasset Wilderness Area, and I was describing the big logging era when all of that land was clear cut during the big timber boom. J.E. Henry and Sons in Lincoln, New Hampshire, basically over the course of about 13 years, clear cut the entire maybe 63,000 acre interior headwaters of the Pemigewasset East Branch of the Pemigewasset River, and that is now the Pemigewasset Wilderness Area. And so there were some European tourists, some folks from Austria or Germany, and they were listening, and they could not imagine that what I described as a smoking moonscape of burning ashes and cinders and stumps and blackened aftermath of clear cutting. Their version of the creation of the White Mountain National Forest was, indigenous Abenaki people lived there, and Uncle Sam showed up in a stripy suit and, met them with their birch bark canoe, and they signed a treaty, and all of a sudden it became a national forest. Like, there's just no gap between
Right.
the primeval forest and the forest that you see today. But there's an incredible industrial history, including logging camps and artifacts and mills and bridges and trestles and railroads and old charcoal kilns out in the woods where, they were cooking trees to make charcoal, which was a commodity of its time. And all of that is obscured by now an 80 to 100-year-old forest that has grown back in the last century over that. And the edges of the national forest include these wonderful state parks like Crawford Notch State Park and Franconia Notch State Park, where there's a history of tourism. And in that era between the 1880s and the early 1900s to the coming of the automobile in the 19 teens, there were tourists coming from afar, lured by these attractions like the Flume and the Old Man of the Mountain. At the same time, there was tremendous resource extraction, and the logging barons, which was what they were labeled at the time, they were vilified as barons.
Right.
Peculiar term. They pulled the timber out that built the cities of the Eastern Seaboard, all those triple deckers down around Lawrence and Lowell and Boston, and the mill towns, Manchester, Nashua, Lawrence, Lowell, Haverhill. Um, J.E. Henry was a crafty industrialist. He saw an opportunity to turn trees into a commodity that America needed to grow its cities. And then those city people came and were confronted with burned over places that caught on fire from the cinders from the locomotives or
Mhm.
wholesale clear cutting. And in one book that Bill Gove wrote about J.E. Henry's logging railroad, at the end, he does kind of an epilogue, and he has this line. He says, "From the comfort of their rocking chairs came the founders of the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests." And I had him read that at our 100th annual meeting in 2001, because this year we're turning 125 in 2026. And I
Mhm.
asked them to specifically read that because it's true that the founders of the Forest Society was a patrician group and the Appalachian Mountain Club the same, from Boston. And they came for the scenery, and they came for the fishing, and they came for the hiking and climbing. And there was a culture clash. And in the end, it became our federal White Mountain National Forest, which was one of the first two, the other one being in Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina. And today, the White Mountain National Forest is 804,000 acres. And of that, 750,000 is in New Hampshire, and the other 54,000 acres is in Maine.
Okay.
And that is the biggest chunk of federal land in the Northeast. And it's now a forest that's, nearing 100 or 110 years old because the Weeks Act was passed in 1911. It was
Mhm.
actually passed by Congress in 1910 under President Theodore Roosevelt, and then it was signed into law in March of, 1911 under President Taft, and that created the federal authority to set this land aside, and so in 1914, they were doing surveys, and by 1918, they were buying land, and so certainly 100 years ago, 1926, the forest was pretty well established and the trees were growing back. And, we are the inheritors of that legacy of conservation work
Mhm.
and tourism.
I think for me, part of my journey with covered bridges is for people when they go to a covered bridge to understand why that bridge is why it was there in the first place and why it's still there because it just doesn't happen to be there, almost
People
200 years later,
Right, it's because people wanted to preserve that,
Mhm. Right,
and I'm sure you've been.
and that's the piece I think about when you talked about tourism, right? So, I've lived in New Hampshire most of my life, and I lived in Portsmouth for a long time, which depends on tourists, but at the same time, when you live there, you wish there were no tourists because it changes your whole community, but I think it's that love-hate relationship, right? So but it's also getting people to understand that it's not just Santa's Village, right? There are things that not I mean, Santa's Village is fun, but there are other things to see in New Hampshire as part of that visit and why those things matter, I think is really key, and just like you said, it's up to us now
And it's
as people to
changing too.
understand.
I mean, the other thing is it's changing, and this is pretty interesting, kind of a sociological thing. I used to think of, like, I'll pick on Lost River because it is the Forest Society's longest, held continuously owned property. It was protected in 1911, and I used to think of that as being kind of a tourist feature attraction. And yet when I go there now, it's one of my favorite places because you see a much more diverse, culturally diverse, and age diverse audience, and they are laughing, and they're spending a great day outside in the forest. Somebody's going through the caves, somebody's saying, "I'm not going in there." And,
Right.
and grandma's there, and she took the parents, and the parents are there, and now they're taking the grandkids, and they're unplugged, and they're off of screens,
Mhm.
and they ask legit questions like, "Are these rocks real?" Or do you turn the water off at night? Because they've never seen an incredible natural attraction like this, and to say like, "No, this is what the glacier left here
Mhm.
11,000, 12,000 years ago." And it's really, unique in the experience of people from more urban areas. And also, the advent of social media is people are posting and sharing their photos of natural features in New Hampshire so that a much larger audience is able to participate. And I've found myself recently going up Mount Washington on the Cog Railway. We did a Something Wild podcast and we rode the auto coach from
Oh,
the Washington Auto Road and we went to the top. And I find myself, wow. I mean, I used to be an avid hiker. I don't think I could do the 9 mile Franconia loop or even the Pemi loop, which I think is something like 36 miles,
yeah.
and carry a heavy pack like I did in college. I love day hikes, but, um, it shouldn't be that, the backcountry belongs only to, the young who are physically strong and capable enough to get there.
Mhm.
So, making it more accessible to people who have, um, limitations or disabilities and, making it accessible to multiple generations and seeing, like, the power of time spent in the outdoors for people's personal, emotional well-being or, sort of physical and mental wellness is something that I'm kind of thinking about a lot more when I talk about the work of the Forest Society in protecting land. It's a community resource, it's a historical resource, it's an ecological treasure, and I used to divide those things into different sort of buckets, and now I see how it all fits together. It's
Mhm.
an incredible mosaic, how that natural and cultural history fit together.
It definitely is connected. Can you tell us about your organization and how people can find you and support your work?
It would be my pleasure to tell you, Kim, about the work of the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forest. We are celebrating our 125th anniversary, having been founded in 1901. And as the country celebrates its 250th anniversary, well, we're half as old as America. And we were
That's
founded
good.
as yeah, helps keep the numbers straight in my head. But we were founded as, a forestry organization and an advocacy organization. Our 1904 mission statement said something like, "To perpetuate the forests of New Hampshire through their wise use in their complete reservation in places of special scenic beauty." And some of our best-known properties like Monadnock, which is our single largest forest reservation, we own 4,000 acres on Mount Monadnock and, 1,200 acres next door on Gap. So there's 5,000 acres in Jaffrey and Dublin,
Mhm.
that goes back to about 1914 when we got involved, and we were late to the game at Monadnock, but these places, Monadnock, Sunapee, Kearsarge, Franconia Notch, Lost River, the campaign to save the White Mountains has been at the core of what this organization has done for the past 125 years. We're a land conservation trust, and we also are a forestry organization, and we also manage land stewardship for recreation. So we have much more of our resources dedicated to trails
Mm.
and places that are much loved. We have land at Mount Major in Alton overlooking Lake Winnipesaukee. 80,000 people a year hike there, and we just did a major rebuild. So I use an acronym LEAF: land protection, education, advocacy, forestry, and I'll add S, LEAFs, stewardship, taking care of land. And we're based in Concord at our conservation center on Portsmouth Street in East Concord. And we have staff program centers in Portsmouth at Creek Farm, right on the water opposite Wentworth Coolidge on
Mhm.
Little Harbor Road. And we have our North Country Education and Program Center at the Rocks in Bethlehem. And today, the Forest Society owns 209 properties. It's 69,000 acres. And
Wow.
as we look ahead to our next milestones, we would like to see the Forest Society add 30,000 acres and go from 70,000 to 100,000 acres that we own in full fee. We'd also like to see New Hampshire go from 34% protected land to 40% protected land across the state. So that's the land conservation side of it, is protecting land, and then the stewardship side is managing it well, both for
Mhm.
wildlife and for forest resources and clean water and clean air, but also for recreation for people. That's why I keep coming back to Lost River, the place I once said you wouldn't catch me dead, and now it's my favorite place because, I mean, I think in Stairway to Heaven, Led Zeppelin's song that they always played at the end of the high school dance, the last song of the night, he says, "Where the forest will echo with laughter." And when I hear the sound of voices of children and parents and grandchildren grandparents ringing through the woods, and I think this is really one of the highest and best uses of this conservation land is for people to come here and make that connection, and establish in their mind, an idea of New Hampshire that's recognizable. It's what we inherited from our predecessors, and it's our responsibility to pass that down. That's at the heart of what the Forest Society does, protecting the best of New Hampshire. Thank you, Kim.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking to me today. The Covered Bridges of New Hampshire podcast is created and hosted by me and recorded in Hancock, New Hampshire. The song Old New Hampshire was arranged and performed by Josh Black. Our introduction is courtesy of Greg Kretschmar. This podcast is a companion to my book, Covered Bridges of New Hampshire. You can learn more about the book, explore blog posts, view covered bridge videos and photographs, check event listings, and access an interactive covered bridge map at coveredbridgesnh.com. Follow Covered Bridges of New Hampshire on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube for additional content and updates. If you enjoy the podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Kim Chandler. Thank you for listening.